What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for MLB Sunday, September 12th.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top DFS picks for today's MLB slate.
And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made.
Okay guys, we have a 10-game slate today, so let's take a look at the pitcher position. Now, you can go with Lance Lynn. He's got a pretty good matchup versus the Boston Red Sox. The Red Sox have only hit 12 of his last 80 pitches. That's a 150 batting average and a pretty big sample size, but he is coming off of the 10-day injured list with right knee inflammation, so I'm always a little cautious on those guys, but I think he's going to be fine out there. But the guy that I'm looking at tonight or today is Lance McCullers Jr. with a 14% pitching advantage over a low salary batting team, the Los Angeles Angels. Now, Lance McCullers Jr., he pitches his worst ball versus switch hitters. He's given up a .988 OPS versus switch hitters, but luckily for him, he's facing 0 switch hitters here tonight, and he only gives up a .605 OPS versus lefties and a .675 OPS versus righties, and he's facing 3 lefties and 6 righties. And on top of that, the Angels have only hit 12 of his last 54 pitches. That's a .222 batting average. He's $9,000 FanDuel salary, $1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 29.2 fantasy points, averaging 33 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 43, 24, and 29 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He has an ERA of 3.19. His record is 11-4 on the season, pitching an average of 91 pitches per game. So I like Lance McCullers Jr. here versus the Los Angeles Angels. Okay, let's take a look at the catcher first base position. I like Freddie Freeman with a 68% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Edward Cabrera. Freddie Freeman is batting 30% better versus righty pitchers, batting a 1.082 OPS versus righties. And Edward Cabrera, he pitches pretty bad versus lefties, 38% worse than his pitch to righties, giving up a 1.186 OPS versus lefties. Now, there's no at-bats versus Cabrera yet, and Freddie Freeman is $3,800 FanDuel salary, $1,500 more on DraftKings, projected at 12.5 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 16, 9, and 28 fantasy points in his last 3 games. And he's one of my home run hitter picks, so I like Freddie Freeman here versus Edward Cabrera. Now, I also like Josh Bell with a 52% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Bryce Wilson. Josh Bell is batting 6% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .750 OPS versus righties. And Bryce Wilson, he pitches his worst ball by far to switch hitters, 46% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.493 OPS versus switch hitters. Now, Josh Bell is 1-for-1 with a 2 OPS versus Wilson. He's $3,600 FanDuel salary, only $300 more on DraftKings, projected at 10 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 12, 25, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Josh Bell here versus Bryce Wilson. Now I got a value play for you. Take a look at Pedro Severino with a 14% batting advantage over Steven Matz. Pedro Severino, he's batting 6% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .711 OPS versus lefties. And Steven Matz, he throws his worst ball versus righty batters, 8% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .919 OPS versus righties. Now, I like this pick because Pedro Severino is 4 for 6, batting a .667 batting average with a 1.834 OPS versus Matz. One of those 4 hits is for a home run, and he's only $2,200 FanDuel salary. He's $1,400 more on DraftKings, projected at 8.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 7 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 16, 6, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 10 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Pedro Severino here versus Steven Matz. Okay, let's take a look at the second base position. Another home run hitter potential player here. I like Jorge Polanco with an 18% batting advantage over Kris Bubic. Jorge Polanco is batting 9% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .802 OPS versus lefties. And Kris Bubic, he pitches his worst ball versus switch hitters, 8% worse than his other pitches, giving a .892 OPS versus switch hitters. Now, I like this pick because Jorge Polanco is 6 for 11, batting a .545 batting average and a 1.272 OPS versus Bubic. He has 4 singles and 2 doubles, so you know he wants to knock one out of the park here versus Bubic tonight. And Jorge Polanco is $4,100 FanDuel salary, $1,400 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.4 fantasy points here tonight, but I think that's going to be up towards 15 fantasy points or more. That may be a stretch, but I think he's going for a home run. And he's averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 44, 9, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Jorge Polanco here versus Kris Bubic.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
I also like Jean Segura with a 53% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Ryan Feltner. Jean Segura is batting a .753 OPS versus righty pitchers, and Ryan Feltner, he's giving up a 1.929 OPS versus righties, 65% worse than his pitch to lefties. And there's no at-bats versus Feltner yet, but Jean Segura is $3,200 FanDuel salary, $1,700 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.5 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 25, 12, and 6 fantasy points in his last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Jean Segura here versus Ryan Feltner. Okay, let's take a look at the third base position. I like Jose Ramirez with a 36% batting advantage over Eric Lauer. Jose Ramirez is batting 24% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a 1.141 OPS versus lefties. And Eric Lauer, he pitches his worst ball versus switch hitters, 12% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .912 OPS versus switch hitters. There's no at-bats versus Lauer yet, but the splits are fantastic here. And Jose Ramirez is $4,100 FanDuel salary. He's $200 more on DraftKings. projected at 12.6 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 13 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 0, 21, and 22 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Jose Ramirez here versus Eric Lauer. I also like Evan Longoria with a 46% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Justin Steele. Evan Longoria is batting 27% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a 1.014 OPS versus lefties, and Justin Steele, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 19% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .745 OPS versus righties. There's no at-bats versus Steele yet, and Evan Longoria is $3,200 FanDuel salary, $800 more on DraftKings, projected at 11.3 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season, and he's been on fire, scoring 26, 26, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Evan Longoria here versus Justin Steele. I also like Ke'Bryan Hayes with a 41% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Patrick Corbin. Ke'Bryan Hayes is batting 16% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a 1.018 OPS versus lefties. And Patrick Corbin, he pitches his, not his worst ball, but 25% worse to righties as he does lefties, giving up a .892 OPS versus righties. Now, Ke'Bryan Hayes is 0 for 3 versus Corbin, but he's only $2,900 FanDuel salary, $1,400 more on DraftKings, projected at 11.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 6, 13, and 12 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Ke'Bryan Hayes here versus Patrick Corbin. Okay, moving on to the shortstop position. I like Jazz Chisholm Jr. with a 39% batting advantage over Max Fried. Jazz Chisholm Jr. is batting 28% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .827 OPS versus lefties, and Max Fried, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, 10% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .744 OPS versus lefties. Jazz Chisholm is 1 for 5 with a 1.333 OPS versus Fried because that one hit was for a home run. And he's $3,100 FanDuel salary, $1,000 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.8 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 12, 9, and 28 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Jazz Chisholm Jr. here versus Max Fried. I also like Miguel Rojas with a 33% batting advantage over that same pitcher, Max Fried. Miguel Rojas, he's batting 43% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a 1.163 OPS versus lefties. Max Fried is giving up a .667 OPS versus righties. But I like this pick because Miguel Rojas is 6 for 17, batting a .353 batting average and a 1.036 OPS versus Fried. And he's only $2,800 FanDuel salary. He's $1,300 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.8 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 13, 0, and 3 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Miguel Rojas here versus Max Fried. Okay, moving on to the outfield position. I like Kyle Tucker with a 40% batting advantage over Jamie Barria. A low salary pitcher, Jamie Barria. Kyle Tucker is batting 16% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .908 OPS versus righties. And Jamie Barria, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, 24% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .865 OPS versus lefties. Kyle Tucker is 2 for 4 with a 2.667 OPS versus Barria, and both of those hits are home runs. He's $3,200 FanDuel salary, $1,800 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 15, 7, and 25 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Kyle Tucker here versus Jamie Barria. Now, Trey Mancini is in a good spot versus Steven Matz. The splits are fantastic. The only thing that concerns me about this pick is he is 0 for 5 versus Matz, but his salary is pretty low at only $2,900 FanDuel salary and only $700 more on DraftKings. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 10 runs scored in this game, so I think Trey Mancini is an interesting play here tonight. And it looks like the other guy that I like, if you want to save some salary, is Bryan Reynolds with a 23% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Patrick Corbin. Bryan Reynolds, he bats a little bit better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .776 OPS versus lefties. And Patrick Corbin, he pitches his worst ball versus switch hitters, 20% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .980 OPS versus switch hitters. Bryan Reynolds is 3 for 7, batting a .429 batting average and a .858 OPS versus Corbin. He's only $2,800 on FanDuel. He's $1,900 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.5 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 38, 3, and 3 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Bryan Reynolds here versus Patrick Corbin.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.